The narrative structure of the prequel era frames Mustafar as the moment Anakin Skywalker abandoned the Jedi Order. Yet a close analytical review of earlier events reveals that his ideological shift began long before the confrontation in the industrial complex. The cinematic presentation of his transformation often highlights dramatic battles and decisive choices, but the gradual accumulation of formative pressures, systemic contradictions, and institutional failures shaped a trajectory that made the outcome on Mustafar an endpoint rather than an origin. By beginning with an understanding of Anakin's early experiences and their relationship to the Jedi framework, it becomes clear that his fall emerged from long-term processes rather than sudden collapse. The earliest indicators of Anakin's divergence from Jedi expectations appear in his introduction to the Order. His recruitment required an immediate separation from his primary emotional anchor, and although the Council treated the decision as necessary for training, the long-term consequences were not assessed. The Jedi model assumed that detachment would cultivate balance, yet Anakin entered the institution with pre-existing bonds and fears that the Order's instructional systems were not designed to accommodate. His transition from civilian life to monastic discipline occurred abruptly, producing internal tension between personal history and institutional doctrine. These unresolved inconsistencies established the foundation for his later conflict with Jedi teachings. As Anakin progressed through training, structural friction emerged between his instinctive decision-making and the Council's interpretive frameworks. The Order valued equilibrium, measured responses, and strict adherence to procedure, while Anakin's approach relied on improvisation, rapid adjustment, and emotional reasoning. Instead of integrating these tendencies into a modified instructional model, the Order treated them as traits requiring suppression. The expectation that Anakin conformed to an established doctrinal mold placed continuous pressure on him to regulate behaviors that were intrinsic to his identity. This dynamic produced an ongoing internal conflict that the Order attempted to manage through caution rather than through tailored mentorship. The political climate of the Republic further intensified the tension between Anakin's disposition and Jedi expectations. His early missions exposed him to humanitarian crises, governmental inconsistencies, and moral ambiguities that challenged the idealized worldview presented in training. While the Jedi framed their role as peacekeeping, many assignments required interventions shaped by political necessity rather than philosophical clarity. This discrepancy between doctrine and practice forced Anakin to reconcile conflicting messages about justice and authority. The absence of explicit guidance regarding these contradictions left him to interpret experiences without a structured ethical framework, weakening his alignment with the institution's foundational principles. Anakin's close relationship with Chancellor Palpatine functioned as a counterbalance to the restrictive environment of the Jedi Order. Palpatine provided a platform for open expression, unstructured conversation, and personal validation that contrasted with the Council's cautious approach. Rather than challenging Anakin's concerns, Palpatine encouraged exploration of unresolved doubts surrounding the Order's methods. This dynamic shaped Anakin's perception of institutional authority, presenting alternative interpretations of events that emphasized autonomy and individual agency. The consistent reinforcement of Anakin's abilities and viewpoints created a second ideological center of gravity that gradually displaced his reliance on the Jedi for guidance. The onset of the Clone Wars accelerated the divergence between Anakin's lived experience and the Order's philosophical framework. The shift from peacekeeping to military leadership placed him in command roles that required rapid tactical judgment and willingness to accept operational risk. These responsibilities amplified traits the Council had attempted to moderate, such as decisive action and emotional investment in outcomes. The Jedi's inability to reconcile their doctrine with wartime realities left Anakin navigating ethical terrain unsupported by institutional insight. His victories in battle did not resolve these tensions, but instead masked the growing gap between the Order's teachings and the demands of his responsibilities. The repetitive exposure to loss during the war further reshaped Anakin's worldview. The structure of military engagement produced continuous turnover among allies and soldiers, placing him in a recurring cycle of grief that the Jedi were not prepared to address. The Order's detachment model was designed for measured, interpersonal relationships, not for the emotional complexities generated by sustained conflict. Without frameworks for processing cumulative trauma, Anakin internalized patterns of urgency and overprotection. These patterns reinforced a belief that preventing loss required preemptive action, which conflicted with Jedi principles that emphasize patience and reflection. The war thus altered his decision-making processes by reshaping his understanding of threat and responsibility. The Council's mistrust of Anakin became more pronounced as his wartime influence grew. Instead of recognizing that his increasingly assertive behavior reflected structural pressures from the conflict, the Council interpreted it as evidence of instability. This interpretation shaped several consequential decisions, including the denial of master rank and the assignment to spy on the Chancellor. These actions signaled institutional doubt rather than institutional support, reinforcing Anakin's belief that the Order undervalued and misunderstood him. This perception weakened his identification with the Jedi and increased his reliance on external affirmation. The resulting tension produced an adversarial mindset that positioned the Council as an obstacle rather than as an anchor. Anakin's secret marriage functioned as both a symptom and a catalyst of ideological divergence. The marriage represented a personal commitment that contradicted Jedi doctrine, forcing him to maintain two separate identities. The need for secrecy created distance between Anakin and the Order, as he could not seek guidance or voice concerns without exposing the relationship. The lack of institutional support for his emotional life deepened his isolation, making him increasingly reliant on his own judgment. This isolation contributed to a cognitive environment where alternative viewpoints gained influence, particularly those offered by Palpatine, who consistently positioned himself as a confidant rather than a superior. The shift in Council operations during the final year of the war further weakened Anakin's trust in institutional stability. Internal debates surrounding the role of the Jedi in state leadership highlighted inconsistencies in interpretation of their mandate. Concerns about political overreach led to cautious decision-making, but the war created circumstances that demanded decisive action. Anakin observed deliberations that produced delayed responses and compromises that did not address underlying problems. These observations reinforced his belief that the Order's structure lacked the flexibility required to address emerging dangers. The resulting frustration made external viewpoints more appealing. The increasing secrecy within both the Council and the Senate altered Anakin's perception of transparency and leadership. The Council withheld information about intelligence operations, the Senate delegated emergency powers through classified sessions, and military strategy became increasingly compartmentalized. Anakin's partial access to information produced a fragmented understanding of events, creating gaps that he filled with assumptions shaped by previous experiences. This informational imbalance contributed to his growing suspicion that critical decisions were being made without consideration for broader consequences. Such suspicion encouraged him to question directives rather than follow them, reshaping his relationship with authority. The operational demands of the war produced changes in Anakin's tactical reasoning that shaped his later actions. Extended command responsibilities required rapid assessment of incomplete data, delegation of risk to subordinates, and acceptance of collateral outcomes. These patterns normalized high-stakes decision-making and strengthened his confidence in personal judgment. The repetition of situations requiring immediate action reduced reliance on consultative processes, increasing his willingness to act independently. By the late stages of the conflict, Anakin's approach to problem-solving favored direct intervention over deliberation, a tendency that shaped his choices when confronted with escalating crises. The influence of Anakin's interpersonal relationships intensified as institutional structures weakened. His trust in individual actors often outweighed trust in organizations. Partnerships formed through shared missions, such as those with clone officers and political figures, shaped his understanding of loyalty and responsibility. Unlike the Order's emphasis on collective duty, Anakin interpreted loyalty as a direct commitment to individuals. This interpretation complicated his assessment of risk, as he viewed threats to key relationships as threats to stability itself. The prioritization of personal connections over institutional expectations played a significant role in his response to impending loss. An important factor in Anakin's psychological trajectory was his growing belief that traditional methods were insufficient to prevent large-scale suffering. Observations of systemic breakdown, inefficient governance, and inconsistent legal enforcement convinced him that compliance with established procedures would not produce meaningful change. This belief encouraged him to consider solutions outside the boundaries of institutional authority. When alternative viewpoints presented the possibility of decisive action, he interpreted them not as temptations, but as potential corrections to perceived systemic failure. This reinterpretation of authority contributed to his readiness to engage in actions contradicting Jedi doctrine. The progression of Anakin's internal logic becomes clearer when examining his response to sudden shifts in political power. The rapid escalation of emergency measures created an environment in which legal structures were modified with little opposition. Anakin observed that broad changes could occur with minimal deliberation when leaders deemed them necessary. This observation shaped his belief that drastic action was acceptable when aligned with perceived greater purpose. The normalization of expedited decision-making influenced his acceptance of proposals that bypassed traditional review. This cognitive shift prepared him to support solutions that concentrated authority rather than distributed it. The Council's decision to limit Anakin's access to high-level deliberations during the final days of the war reinforced his perception of exclusion. Instead of reassuring him, the decision communicated institutional doubt and contributed to his sense of marginalization. The Council's hesitance to trust his judgment was interpreted as confirmation that they valued compliance over insight. This interpretation further eroded his connection to the Order's leadership and increased his reliance on alternative sources of guidance. The resulting divide deepened ideological distance and weakened the possibility of reconciliation. Anakin's assessment of the Jedi Order shifted significantly when he observed inconsistencies between stated values and operational practices. The Order promoted impartiality, yet its participation in political and military strategy contradicted that ideal. The Order emphasized protection, yet restrictive doctrines prevented it from addressing urgent humanitarian needs in ways that aligned with his instincts. These inconsistencies urged him to question whether adherence to doctrine served the needs of the galaxy. As doubts accumulated, they formed a framework in which alternative philosophies appeared more effective. This shift in evaluation altered his ideological identity and reshaped his interpretation of the Order's purpose. The combined influence of wartime responsibility, institutional inconsistency, and personal isolation produced a cognitive environment ripe for reinterpretation of loyalty. By the time Anakin was presented with claims that framed the Jedi Council as a destabilizing force, his experiences provided enough contextual support for those claims to seem credible. The shift did not occur suddenly, but through gradual accumulation of doubts that reshaped his expectations of institutional fidelity. When confronted with a scenario requiring immediate allegiance decisions, Anakin selected the option that aligned with his revised interpretation of stability, authority, and protection. The final steps leading to Mustafar can therefore be understood not as deviations from established patterns, but as logical conclusions of Anakin's revised worldview. His choices were shaped by years of institutional misalignment, personal contradictions, and increasing preference for decisive authority. The confrontation on Mustafar represented an endpoint of a trajectory formed through accumulated pressures rather than a break from previous behaviour. By contextualizing his turn within long-term structural and cognitive developments, it becomes clear that the fall of Anakin Skywalker was not the result of a sudden collapse, but of a steady progression that transformed him, long before the final battle.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.